The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe. The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe. The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe. The UK is one of the least racist, the UK is one of the least racist societies. The UK is one of the least racist, the UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe.
Hello. This video is going to be an attempt at examining a claim that I've heard used more in recent years. The claim being that Britain is one of the least racist societies in the world, largely, I'm told, because we are a progressive and fair society. Now, assessing the racism in Britain isn't new. It's had academic and journalistic research done, and governing bodies have been looking at it a lot more closely as of late, thanks to far-right parties and attacks gaining more prominence and power. But it blew up on social media after the statement was made on Question Time back in October of 2018. Question Time, for those who have had the joy to avoid it, is a BBC panel show discussing political issues on a weekly basis and has been running for about 40 years. Its main grab is that its panellists are often prominent people, like politicians, journalists, writers, business heads, and similar, who answer topics brought up by audience members who can directly respond or ask further questions. As a format, it's got major issues, and its actual execution is dubious, with evidence of lesser-known politicians planted in the audience. Regardless, in this particular episode, the discussion was on immigration, a discussion Britain never shuts up about. Here's part of the clip that the BBC put out that got the big response.
The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe.
Oh, phew! Thank you so much. So I didn't get stopped by police sitting outside of my mum's house earlier this year. That didn't happen to me. Oh, thank you. I should have just explained that to the police officers.
But they're talking about ending preferential treatment for Europeans, so we can take people from Singapore and Malaysia and Thailand to come in.
Oh, phew.
That's an open policy.
Bro.
All right.
This clip frames a black man, George Mpunga, known as George the Poet, getting loud in front of a calm white audience member in a talk of racism. One of them cites evidence, the other cites personal experience. At a glance, the clip largely favours the audience member and therefore the argument of the UK not being that racist. However, the context of this moment is key. Though I'm going to generally describe the episode leading up to the statements made, I'd recommend anyone watch the Question Time episode so they can have their own view on the events. Anyway, earlier in the episode that the clip came from, George was asked his opinion on a question from an audience member about immigration. He put forward the idea that Britain's immigration policy and the discussion around it was influenced by the UK's xenophobia.
I think British xenophobia is the reason for migration coming under attack. Straight up.
Before he even got to the end of his sentence, a white panellist interrupted him, saying, "That's not true." His points were largely ignored by the other white panellists too. The talk moved on from George's point for about 10 minutes to other immigration discussion, which never directly addressed his ideas. That was until his point was misconstrued and dismissed again by a couple of white audience members.
But also, George, to make the point that it's about British xenophobia, I personally think that's scaremongering.
George made the point about the xenophobia and that everyone that voted to leave the EU was a xenophobe. I've just heard plenty.
He didn't actually say that.
Okay, but
he again had to reiterate his point and defend how people were misconstruing it as a personal attack instead of as a political factor that he explained before. He told of government policies that had immigration vans patrolling some of the poorest sectors in the UK and in Afro-Caribbean communities, and how these policies were desired by the UK population because they had voted in the government based on their policies. Again, a panellist said he was wrong, and someone from the audience even shouted out whilst George was explaining himself. By this point, George had either been interrupted, talked down to, or misinterpreted over half a dozen times. But it wasn't stopping there. A few minutes later, another white person in the audience directly addressed George and came back with his claim.
George, have you actually looked at the numbers? The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe.
Oh, phew!
Of course, none of this could be backed up with the numbers, as the guy claimed. Question Time lets almost any statement be said without actual evidence or fact-checking. The guy then continued to ignore and talk over George's experience of racial profiling by the police earlier that year. So, in the wider context of the show, the idea of a loud black man shouting at a white guy shifts a little. For over half an hour, several people were either not equipped or purposefully dismissing George's statement and ignorantly had already told him he was wrong, even as he brought up both national xenophobia and a personal experience. Sarcastically thanking the audience member seemed like an appropriate response in the face of racism denial. Not so much on social media, it seems. Question time might be where evidence goes to die, but Twitter is where discussion goes to die. Thanks largely to people only seeing the clip rather than the full episodes, the reactions were awful. The typical racism denial in Britain, the reverse racism claims, and also something unexpected for me. Long story short, whilst on Twitter talking to a person I follow who had posted the question time clip, the "Britain is the least racist" guy from the audience jumped into our conversation. He was touting evidence being circulated by a right-wing blog writer, and he seemed to be searching Twitter for reactions to his provocative statement. His name was Harry Scoffin. He replied as pretty much like he did on Question Time, claiming the UK was tolerant, even as I and others put forward evidence against it. It went nowhere, basically, and I would have largely ignored his statement until I found out more about him. I discovered with my keen detective skills, I googled his name, that not only was he a Conservative Party member, but he was even the Conservative candidate for Poplar in 2018's local election. His name's on the ballot, he has social media accounts for his campaign, and even a YouTube channel promoting it. Harry Scoffin didn't win the seat, unfortunately for Harry, but that hasn't stopped him from holding good Conservative values, like denying racism, saying he was misinterpreted by the BBC, and being a Tory candidate who was picked out of a Question Time audience. Imagine that. Regardless, it can't be ignored that this puts a slant on his comments dismissing racism as a factor of immigration control, considering the Conservative Party's immigration policies he was standing for when he was a candidate. So, I've been on social media for years, seeing denials of bigotry, largely from white guys who don't wish to see that there are complex issues at play. It is not new. But after seeing the different reactions towards Scoffin and George on social media, it made me realise that a white person challenging the narrative of Britain being a racially kind and equal society isn't that often seen. At least in mainstream media. There's videos of debates on news programmes, talk shows and documentaries all about racism in the UK. And after watching them, you start to notice things. There are way more white people accepting views like Scoffin's as the acceptable outcome, which is largely the problem. It ends up falling upon people of colour to prove racism, whilst many white people would largely dismiss their experience or evidence.
I don't think that's racist though. That's
I've heard you say you don't like certain black people because you think they're niggers.
Because you got people that walk around, suck their teeth. I'm bad, I'm a gangster, I'm this, I'm that, yeah? You're a nigger, yeah? If you walk around, you're just a general black guy.
But that's racist.
There will be claims of no racism when it's pointed out, of playing some sort of race card, or that's some conspiracy to hate white people. But if a white guy talks about race, especially with the notion it's not such an issue, they get invited onto the radio or TV, host panels about race, and lead the conversation in such a way that lessens the issues of racism discussion and action. So, to finally get on with this video, a white guy is going to try to address this claim of Britain being the least racist country. Oh, where to begin? It's where the UK decided to leave the European Union through a non-binding public vote with a minor majority saying leave, which came about thanks to a split in the leading party of the UK at the time, the Conservative Party, who have been split on the issue for decades. The only reason the vote was held was partially as a response by the Conservatives to take back control of the votes and party members who they were losing millions of to the far-right party UKIP, whose defining trait was leaving the EU. And during this, the Conservatives continued infighting on the issue of the EU, which then exploded, now affecting tens of millions of people on an international scale, thanks to the Brexit means Brexit talk, but no actual Brexit, which, like, a week away from recording this is going to happen, but with no deal. But before leaving, we still don't know how many outcomes of leaving will actually mean in this. A discussion on Brexit is where the least racist country claim was presented by Harry Scoffin. George hadn't specified it initially, and I don't think he was narrowing the concept of xenophobia and racism to just European-based. But as the conversation moved on, inevitably, Brexit was there now. It's unavoidable because of how massive an impact it has. When Scoffin tried to defend his claim, he goes on to say how the government were going to end preferential treatment for Europeans and instead let in more migrants from Singapore, Thailand and Malaysia. His statement shows a massive misunderstanding of what immigration is like for people of colour. I also can't find any source for his claims, so how is the EU linked to the discussion on immigration and racism anyway? Well, like Scoffin brought up, it's how the EU's immigration policies compare to the UK's. The EU has a free movement principle of basically borderless movement between its member countries and some adjacent non-member countries. It means you don't need visas or passport checks at borders, sort of like how the UK allows citizens between Wales, Scotland and England to move without checks. It's been claimed that this freedom of movement allows undesirables into Britain without proper processing because, as a member of the EU, the UK would be governed by the same borderless rules.
And of course, once we leave the European Union, we will have the opportunity to ensure that we have control of our borders here in the UK.
This was most obvious in the Vote Leave campaign, which used the potential inclusion of Turkey into the EU as an access into the UK.
Imagine what will happen when you're paying for the Euro bailouts. Imagine what will happen to public services when Albania, Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia and Turkey join the EU.
Not only had Turkey already been applying for over a decade by the time the Brexit vote started, and were nowhere near joining it in that whole time, but the UK had the power to veto Turkey joining at any time, thanks to the powers given to them as a member of the EU. But even before all that, even if Turkey did eventually join, Britain has never been a part of this borderless movement that most of Europe subscribes to. The Schengen area, as it's called, was something Britain opted out of, meaning we keep passport checks and other checks within the country's borders. In or out of the EU, Britain will have monitoring and decision making over their own border security anyway. After we leave, though, there's still no clear idea about what that will mean for movement between the EU and the UK now. If the talks of harsher immigration control are true, then, theoretically, this will mean we'll impose harsher restrictions to the EU in line with what we put towards other countries. But in practice, it's hard to see the actual outcome of this. Since the Conservatives have been in power, their aim has been to control immigration numbers.
We do want to bring net migration down to sustainable levels. We believe that is the tens of thousands.
However, their target of having less than 100,000 net immigrants has remained the same for almost 10 years that they've been in power, and has never once been met, not even close. Arguing that leaving the EU will help this sort of makes sense in trying to reduce numbers, but it actively ignores how the party treats immigration. Even if the Conservatives were to block literally every EU immigrant from coming into the country after we leave, we wouldn't be under the 100,000 goal they themselves have set. So they already have full control over non-EU immigration and are still not meeting their target. It's like they don't want to meet their proposed target. In fact, in 2015, net immigration under the Conservative government reached the highest it's ever been in UK history. So when Scoffin made the assertion that preferential treatment would end, it's impossible to say why racism wouldn't be a factor. Considering Turkey is apparently coming, and we can't stop the amount of immigrants coming in, the biggest indictment I can see against his challenge of the UK's xenophobia is that, as a country, we effectively said to our closest neighbours that we no longer want them around. And the main reasons for it? According to economists Ipsos Mori, in the week leading up to the vote, 1 in 3 of those polled saw immigration as the most important issue of the vote. After the vote, even more polling seemed to agree with this as a major issue for most Leave voters. Ashcroft's polls showed that 1/3 of Leave voters said their main reason for voting to leave was to control immigration. In the British Social Attitudes Survey, 73% of Leave voters were worried about immigration. Though the percentage will be different, immigration is always a top issue in most polls around Brexit. The main political party of our country has been eating itself for years about immigration, and once the referendum was called, this mess spiralled. To claim that we are not a racist country seems to ignore the inherent xenophobia in saying immigration is one of our country's biggest concerns.
It's all about immigration, right? It's not about trade or Europe or anything like that. It's all about immigration. It's to stop the Muslims from coming into this country. Simple as that.
So you think you voted to leave the EU to stop Muslims coming to the country?
To stop immigration.
Right.
But the movement of people in Europe, fair enough. But not from Africa, Syria, Iraq, everywhere else. It's all wrong.
And this is such old hat for us. Britain has had immigration as a negative talking point since the original post-war immigration started. Despite our growing economy over the decades and being one of the richest countries on the planet, we still have arguments about immigrants making the UK worse. Some even try to argue that, but it's just not the case. Research posted by multiple groups, including Migration Watch UK and the Financial Times, who both take opposing stances on reading immigration statistics, largely agree that the issues we blame immigrants for the most are not caused by them. Immigrants are often blamed for decreasing wages or putting pressure on the NHS, but the research consensus agrees that it's likely very minimal, and if it does affect it at all, it is neither by a significant amount, nor did immigration cause the issues in the first place. You want to blame someone for decreasing your wages? Blame your boss. You want to blame someone for not funding the NHS? Blame the government. Even then, some research has placed migration as a net positive to these services, either through taxes or filling worker shortages, effectively making Britain more money than if we didn't have them. We may blame immigrants for using the NHS, but immigrants are also the people who help run it. The issues that people place at the feet of immigrants are rooted in Britain's own issues. It's the widening of austerity, the cuts to funding for the public sector, the gig economy, stuff that is all based on what's happening in Britain. So, if immigration is not the main reason for negative impacts on the UK, as is often claimed, then why is immigration still such a concern for people? There is no evidence to say that immigration is as big as we make it out to be. This is where George's original point fits in. He attempted to explain one of the reasons for the British obsession with immigration by stating xenophobia is a key part of the issue. If it's not economic issues, which many researchers agree, then we must look elsewhere, and xenophobia cannot be ignored as a part of that. Indeed, it shaped the conversation of our country for over half a century. I hope you like history, because I'm about to take you back in time. It's a few years after the Second World War. Millions of lives have been decimated, and the world saw new, horrible depths to humanity. For the British Empire, this means rebuilding many of the areas bombed during the war by German air raids. Having lost many people in the war, those from British colonies are looked to for filling in the workers' gap. And so starts the story of the HMS Empire Windrush. The Windrush was a military naval vessel used in World War II. When it docked in Kingston, Jamaica, on the 21st of June 1948, it and other Caribbean islands were still part of the British Empire. That same year, a British law was being discussed that would recognise all peoples under British rule as British citizens. Thanks to these new rights, over 800 Caribbean residents took the chance to head to London on the vessel. Many were veterans from the war, some of who were looking to find work, join the military again, or were using it as a chance to see the mother country.
And why have you come to England? To seek a job. And what sort of job do you want? Any type, so long as I get a good pay.
These people were the first of the Windrush generation, a group of Caribbean immigrants who arrived in the decades after the war. Their arrival contributed a massive part to British culture and for many years after. However, their arrival was not fully appreciated by some. Many citizens from the colonies faced racial discrimination from all levels of society. There were politicians calling for specific checks on people of colour, business owners who discriminated against serving black people, and landlords charging black tenants twice the rate of white tenants. And of course, overtly racist assaults and abuse. Many wanted black people to be removed from the country altogether. We could maybe agree that most of the pervasive racial issues of the past have moved on from these incidents. Overt racism is perhaps a lot rarer than we once knew, but it's not suddenly gone or stopped being a real problem. And worse, the rhetoric around it seems as rampant as ever. There are interviews from the time attempting to figure out the race riots occurring in parts of the country, notably the Notting Hill race riots. Here, a white business owner is talking about black immigrants taking housing from whites, not integrating, and committing crime to make money.
Well, now, what about the trouble in the district? Do you think that the coloured people ought not to live in this district?
Well, I wouldn't say the coloured people shouldn't live here, but I certainly say that there's a large element that should be taken out because they're living on women and one thing and the other.
Is especially living on women a specific thing in this district?
Yes, it is rather bad around here.
Why is that?
I don't know, maybe it's the overcrowding. But my own personal opinion is this, that I happen to know plenty of white people who can't get a home, yet these people continually come in the country, and even these children have got much to look forward to as far as getting married when they get a bit older, have they? They can't get homes. People around the corner wait 4 years, I know, with a child.
Why can't the coloured people get homes and the white people can't?
Well, from what I understand, that they all club together and they simply buy a place up, just like that.
Well, why can't the white people do that?
What's the real kicker for me is that I've heard this exact argument made in my lifetime. This argument from the mid-20th century is still touted today, primarily from right-wing voices and media, and the effects of it are still markedly racist. The association of crime to black people has continued to see them being overrepresented in the criminal justice system, especially in many stereotypical ways. Little has changed here. A more recent issue is the right to rent policy. Introduced in 2016, it essentially allowed landlords to discriminate against tenants based on their ethnicity or nationality, and was recently found to be in breach of human rights by the High Court of Justice. This isn't a far cry from the no Irish, no blacks, no dogs type of mentality that was around the UK 70 years prior. Then, like now, Britain has vilified ethnic and racial groups that don't fit into whiteness enough. The actual rhetoric on immigration hasn't largely changed either, except that most racism surrounding it has become more covert in its usage. The Windrush scandal that broke in 2018 cemented this complete hostility all the way up to the government, and showed how the xenophobic idea of send them back from where they came from that appeared in the 50s still exists today. The Windrush scandal involves several Windrush generation immigrants or their UK-born family members being treated as illegal immigrants under the hostile environment policy, a policy that makes it as difficult as possible for people to live in the UK. Many were detained, lost their jobs or homes, denied legal rights such as benefits and medical care, threatened with expulsion from the country, and in at least 63 cases were wrongly deported. Though these people should have been protected under previous legislation, as they had full and legal British citizenship, hundreds of members received letters notifying them that they were not eligible to remain in the country. This had been occurring under the then Home Secretary, Theresa May, the current-ish Prime Minister. When this scandal broke, this had already been occurring for years, when many people were openly informing the Home Office, both from local communities and international leaders from places like Jamaica, that this was occurring under her watch. But it kept going on. Who would have thought something named the Hostile Environment Policy would be bad? Many have argued how and why this could have happened, considering these people were legally recognised as citizens, and many have been in the country for several decades. It's not hard to see that these issues have disproportionately affected people of colour. When George brought up the Immigrants Go Home vans sent by the Immigration Department of the government, these were on purpose and were put into these communities.
These policies swept up British citizens and legal migrants, causing them immense suffering, as she was warned. So can the Prime Minister send a clear message today and tell us the hostile environment is over, and that her bogus immigration targets that have driven this hostile culture will be scrapped? The Windrush generation have served this country and deserve better than this.
Despite its clear institutional racist effect and failure as a system, Theresa May announced that the hostile environment policy would still be enforced, And though the British public's outrage was largely in support of the Windrush generation, nothing came about from it. Repeated promises and schemes when the news initially broke fizzled into little, as these same people were failed again and again to regain their citizenship rights, let alone a promised compensation. It gets even worse. More groups of black citizens and immigrants are still being forced onto planes again and sent back to a country they haven't maybe ever seen or have any family in, most likely because they fit the stereotype of a bad immigrant. Some have minor convictions from the youth, which was enough to deport these people, apparently. Is this less racist than how other European countries treat people of colour? There are stories of French people defending the deportation of African migrants and asylum seekers, and a viral video of a Swedish woman stopping the deportation of an Afghan man. Is this the more racist Europe that Scoffin is talking about? If I wanted to, I could argue that the rest of Europe is nowhere near as racist as us. The truth is we're a lot more alike when it comes to racism than some are willing to admit, but the way it's manifested has been different. This seemed hard to stomach for some, but Brexit actually made it a lot clearer. The racism and xenophobia experienced by Muslim and Asian people has dealt with a very similar response from White Britain, and the recent anti-Eastern European bigotry which has become more apparent. I can't see how we are any more racially tolerant than anywhere else. And it's not all down to Brexit, it just made all the whispers behind people's backs a lot louder. Whilst looking at how wider society approached racism and immigration, I want to focus on the other important factor, which is politics. Now, this has an intersection of a bunch of different issues, some of which we've explored, but even that is only a small part. It comes down to the legacy of Britain, from way back when to how it's influenced things now. And nowhere is that more prominent than in the politicians we've got. Ladies, gentlemen and beyond, I give you the Right Honourable Member of Parliament for Uxbridge and South Ruislip, Big Dick Special Big Boy, Boris de Pfeffel Johnson. Johnson has been one of the most public-facing politicians in the last few decades, appearing on comedy panel shows and having a distinct look. He's infamous for his buffoonery and almost slapstick nature as a politician. He's well known for his bleach blonde and messy hair, as well as his comical posh droll.
As they say. Well, I thought it was quite good. I don't, never mind that one.
In many ways, Johnson is the popular and welcoming face of the Conservative Party for the last few decades. But how much of that is true? His appearance and personality has been analysed by some political writers as equally disarming of threat and a purposeful construction. He has quite literally scruffled his own hair before making public speeches to appear less threatening and innocent. He also admires one of the most racist and infamous men to commit genocide of the 20th century. That's right, Winston Churchill. I knew Churchill was a bloody monster before Piers Morgan started crying over him on Twitter, so don't think I'm riding the wave of fucking Piers Morgan tweets. Sure, he's more widely remembered for the words he said in the Second World War, but his actions scream a lot louder. He was a staunch white supremacist, a big believer in British colonial power, and was basically a warmonger looking to kill whichever foreigners opposed him. He got his answers multiple times in his life. His actions led to the suffering and deaths of millions of Commonwealth citizens, based on his belief that as a white guy he knew better. Even contemporaries said this guy was a wrong 'un when it came to his racist views. Boris Johnson wrote a book about him a few years back called The Churchill Effect, where throughout it he both praises Churchill's abilities and seems to allude to both of them being akin to each other. And his love of Churchill feels a lot more revealing of Johnson's own worldview when it comes to international affairs. Churchill was the head of the British Empire whilst he was Prime Minister of Britain, and wielded that power like he owned the world. He created a persona and made himself an effective orator with how he spoke and conducted himself. What you have been taught of Churchill has been a construction to put towards the public. Boris has copied many of the same actions for his political image, cultivating not only the look of a Churchill inheritor, but believing himself to be one too. As a former mayor of London and foreign secretary, Boris Johnson is perhaps one of the most successful politicians of the last few decades, and has done so whilst being openly racist and colonialist in his expressions and voting record. He was, and still is, a journalist for right-wing media outlets, and has written several racist pieces in his time. His tenure as Foreign Secretary, effectively the international representative for Britain, during Brexit, was controversial from the get-go. His past racist accounts and writing initially made him a bad choice for the role, and his continued racist remarks and actions during that time only furthered his imperialistic view on the world. The foreigners need Britain more than Britain needs them.
I'm proud to say we export cake in growing quantities, a particularly dense and glutinous kind of chocolate cake. We export from Walthamstow to France. They love our cake in France. Do you seriously believe that they would put up tariffs against UK produce of any kind when they know how much they want to sell us their cake, their champagne, their cheese from France? It is totally and utterly absurd.
So he's either successful because no one knows about his xenophobia at all, or, hear me out, he is successful because of his xenophobia. Again, Johnson is the image of the fool, but his dog-whistling antics are anything but foolish. To a number of people, he represents the good old-fashioned values of a Churchill-bashing nationalist posh politician who can say bigoted things and get away with it. He can whip up sentiment and blag his way out of arguments whilst looking harmless. If this country was less racist than other countries in Europe, I wouldn't see this kind of man still rising to the top despite his lack of merit or character, especially on the back of racism and xenophobia. He wouldn't be placed as Foreign Secretary, the voice of the UK to other countries. He wouldn't have been mayor for the most diverse and marginalised groups of people in the UK. Nor would I see him being discussed as future Prime Minister material today. But here we are. Speaking of a bigoted globuloid in politics, I'd like to bring your attention to Nigel Farage, leader of the UKIP party, or ex-leader of UKIP, or our great and venerable leader who squashes foreigners. Who knows when you're watching this video? Farage is known largely for his beer swilling and smoking, essentially fitting the stereotype of that racist down your local pub. He, like Johnson, has cultivated an image of being a regular sort of bloke that makes him more approachable than regular politicians. He openly despises those he calls the elite and claims himself to be poor, despite being the highest earning British MEP and jetting about in private planes. You know, just your regular working class sort of guy. This image makes him appear charming despite the ideas behind his honeyed words, and it certainly sent him into the media sphere. He hosts his own radio show and has appeared as topics of documentaries on entertainment programmes and various news outlets internationally. He's also Question Time's most frequent panellist since 2000, which altogether makes him one of the most widely known politicians in the UK. When Farage was being interviewed for a Channel 4 documentary in 2015, at a time when UKIP had gained a single seat, he was asked directly if in UKIP land there would be any laws against discrimination based on race and colour. Farage replied no, saying the party is colourblind and that it's no longer a problem today.
So, in UKIP land, there would be no law against discrimination on the grounds of nationality. Would there be a law against discrimination on the grounds of race or colour?
No.
I don't think I need to point out why this is bad, but this statement isn't too far beyond the one that Harry Scoffin posed on Question Time. And here we have one of the most broadcast politicians in the country who openly collaborates with far-right figures, declaring that he would remove rights against discrimination if he was in power. What does this say about the UK's stance on racism? There are equivalent parties throughout Europe who have made similar statements in their bid to stoke xenophobia and racism on the back of anti-immigration. But because it's trussed up in British speak, it's somehow less racist? And though some may say that UKIP has never had much political power in this country, again, Farage is one of the most well-known politicians in the country, despite never being an MP. UKIP's main goal of leaving the EU has had the biggest impact on everything. His party achieved what it wanted to and what it set out to be, which is perhaps more than we can say for other main parties. So the idea he isn't influential seems to go against what has happened. Farage got called out on his statement by several politicians and the public, and he denied ever answering the question. This being the millionth time UKIP claims it isn't racist, he was able to get away with it, largely unscathed, and continues as a somehow respected person worthy of public attention. Now, we have two very prominent political figures who have come under fire, justifiably, for their racist words, and yet have taken almost no professional flack for it. Neither have lost their jobs, been reprimanded by their parties, nor have they been rejected by media outlets. So, how do they link to the immigration talk? Well, both have taken a hard stance on Brexit as well. Johnson was part of the Vote Leave campaign that peddled the bus, that bus, whilst Farage was taking the more overt racist stance with their Breaking Point poster depicting people of colour coming into the country, which he blamed on the EU. Their views on immigration are shaped by their inherent xenophobic outlook, and it is welcomed as a legit politics within the UK. They're still here. On the inverse on the treatment of politicians, Diane Abbott, a Labour MP who essentially sits opposite to the two globuloids I mentioned, has suffered markedly different attention. Abbott was the first black woman to be elected as an MP in the UK in 1986. She's been an MP for over 30 years, longer than Johnson's 18 years and Farage's 0 years. She's worked to increase ethnic representation in UK politics, supports LGBT issues, and has won several human rights awards over the years for her political work. Considering her litany of awards and recognition and her long-standing position in office, it would be fair that she would be seen as a respected politician, even more so than Farage or Johnson, right? No. In 2017, Amnesty International published a report that looked at abuse online suffered by female MPs, both in the first half of that year and also in the 6 weeks before the 2017 general election. The report found that female MPs suffered pervasive abuse online, no matter their political affiliation. It also found that despite only making up about 10% of all female MPs, Black and Asian women receive 35% more abuse than their white colleagues, showing that women of colour were more likely to be abused not only because of their gender, but because of their race as well. And these findings are excluding Diane Abbott, because Diane Abbott was by far the most abused MP in the UK. Abbott received over 8,000 abusive tweets during those 6 months, more than received by all SNP and Conservative female MPs combined. The study admits that the number of abusive tweets is likely thousands more for all victims, as it can't account for blocked accounts or deleted tweets, nor the amount of truly abusive tweets their model doesn't detect, which is really scary to think. I want to really highlight this. Diane Abbott, an individual black woman, as an MP, had to be excluded from several data assessments in the report about abuse because the amount she received skewed the data in such a colossal way. She received almost half the abusive tweets in those 6 weeks prior to the election, and a third of them in the 6 months before. That is a lot. Abbott told reporters that she's experienced racist abuse ever since she became an MP, though the amount has skyrocketed thanks to social media, making it more accessible for those lazy racists out there to get shitty. Her experience might not be typical, but it is no less scary the extent of abuse she faces as a black woman in politics, and deters others like her to not enter such a space, lest they incur the same reaction. Knowing all this, I can't reason how our politics isn't somehow connected to racism in the most basic ways. When people like Johnson and Farage can get away with xenophobia, whilst Abbott has to bear the weight for being black in politics, can we say that the UK is the least racist? Racism doesn't make sense on so many levels, but it's still very powerful, and that's the point. It doesn't follow set rules. It's made up along the way to suit whoever is using it to justify whatever that person is trying to say. Even in science, it has a history for justifying horrible bigotry and hate. Scientific racism became a legitimate and international type of science in the 18th century, with scientists and philosophers of the age trying to understand the various ethnic differences between people from around the world. And Britain was into that loads. In the 18th century, Scottish surgeon John Hunter said that black Africans were originally white, but had turned black because of the sun. An English physician, Charles White, believed that black people were a different species entirely, and argued that people of colour were inferior and that white women were more closely resembled to darker-skinned people. Which both are complete bullshit, obviously, but both men were highly respected scientists of their time and are still venerated today for their scientific contributions. When it came to race, however, their science seems to have dried up in the face of bias and prejudice. The thing is, neither of these two ever left Europe, and Hunter only got as far as the neighbouring France whilst he was in the army. It's not hard to imagine that neither of these men even met a black person in their whole lives, and yet were arguing these points as legitimate evidence within academia. Despite them being long well dead, the link between scientific racism and modern racism is still there. White believed that black people were descended from primates in Africa. This still echoes in the racism we see today. Two British footballers, Raheem Sterling and Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, only last year received racist scrutiny by people in the stands. Sterling by his own team's fans shouting racist remarks, and Aubameyang was pelted by various objects, including a banana skin. The link between White's thoughts of black people being descendants of primates and a banana skin being thrown at black people is where it becomes an overtly racist act. It is purposefully saying you are less than me. And the concept of race as we know it today is still rooted in that original Enlightenment era, in which thousands of renowned academics, Hunter and White included, came to fuel scientific racism and normalise the concept of race to this day. Before that, race as we know it did not exist. And with that pseudoscience of classifying race, so too did the ranking of racial groups above or below one another start. In some weird way, trying to rank Britain as the least racist society reminds me of the original white racists saying that they were part of the best race. It's a nationalist type of boast by white people. I'm not saying it's a direct comparison, I'm not saying Scoffin believes any of that, but I can't disassociate the claim Britain is the least racist without acknowledging the extremely racist past. Britain always likes to deny its role in propping up the scientific racism that legitimised its part in the slavery of the African continent, that Britain made huge amounts of money from. Regardless, that has happened. That is in the past. Acknowledging it now is what is needed, but still, people will claim they are not racist. And yet, it's clear that racism does exist as a part of our societal understanding today. But when it comes to white people speaking out against it so blatantly, it's a rarity and often falls to people of colour who don't deserve being responsible for the emotional labour brought on by racism. It is a load that white people need to share too. So, to finally conclude this, let me just return to this statement.
The UK is one of the least racist societies actually across Europe.
Ultimately, this question is a distraction that, at best, tries to deflect a lot of British racism in the past and now the present, but even worse, seems to imply that racism is no longer a big deal. We can all sort of rest now. We've sort of quelled racism because we're the least racist society in Europe now. The thing is, the gains we see today in racial issues were not spearheaded by white people, but by the people and communities it most affected. In 1944, Trinidadian cricketer Leary Constantine was staying at a hotel in London. He was told he couldn't stay for his full booking because a couple of white Americans also staying in the hotel said that they wouldn't share with a... insert racist word here. Constantine took legal action and won, his case being the bedrock of racial discrimination policies for the decades to come. The American civil rights movement also played its part in inspiring British action, such as Malcolm X visiting the UK and the creation of the British Black Panther movement. The group stood for greater power for both black and South Asian communities in the UK and helped to promote the Race Relations Act, which came into action in 1965. It was the first law of its kind in Britain, and though considered a weak law, that couldn't be enforced in many cases, it did begin a gradual change to the open racism within the country. To put this law into context, the Beatles were internationally famous, the Channel Tunnel had been announced, and Doctor Who aired for the first time, all before we even had the first modern racial equality law. My dad was just 16 when it came in. That's really not that long ago when you think about it, when you could legally say you would not hire a person because they were lesser. And it shaped how I was brought up. It shaped how we were all brought up. We may acknowledge that we've come a ways since then, but don't mistake that these rights came about naturally.
Had the Windrush generation not mounted the campaign that they have, had members on this side of the House not raised the matter persistently, there would be no compensation, there would be no review, there would be no apology.
No rights come about naturally. These changes would not have happened without people fighting for them, and it wasn't the white majority fighting for it. And when I hear this thing isn't racist or we're just less racist, like Scoffin said, I'm honestly not surprised. As a majority white country, we don't want to face up to the racism we've helped prop up or just plain ignored for decades, nor address the issues that we're still facing here. And to begin, we still venerate the British Empire, which promoted scientific racism to justify slave trades and subjugation of billions of people throughout its existence. We have the Commonwealth of Nations, a collection of countries Britain once invaded and stole resources from, and who is still ruled by our monarch. And it's these countries we want to give us good trade deals after we leave the EU. Even now, we're using our colonialist links to try and prop up our country. The message on immigration has always been about control, about reducing numbers, about tightening the screws even more for any foreigners trying to live in Britain. There is no answer to this question of, is Britain the least racist? It's useless and a waste of time. Yeah, I know I recorded this video, I'm sorry. But I hope it was informative and that maybe we can actually have a real and transformative debate about tackling racism in this country. There's a list appearing now where I'd recommend getting started by listening to the voices out there who are most affected by it. And it's not white people. Read Akala's Natives, Race and Class in the Ruins of Empire. Watch his Oxford Union address and other stuff on YouTube. Read The Good Immigrant, a collection of short stories by immigrants or their children living in the UK. Listen to the Over the Bridge podcast from a group of black Cambridge graduates discussing loads of stuff, and they're the people who inspired me to talk about this. There is so much more out there. There are so many voices to listen to. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope it was informative, and I wish you all the best. Goodbye.